Okay, so my name is Gina Tonn. I'm an engineer with DNREC. I work in the Division of Watershed Stewardship in the Shoreline and Waterway Management section. And my role is really focused on primarily floodplain management and things related to flood risk. And so I was asked to speak about floodplain mapping in Delaware. And I do have some slides put together, which I can go through, but you know, if there's specific interests your group has or specific questions, you know, feel free to ask. I have sort of some basic information that I've presented in the past on floodplain mapping, you know, but I'm happy to go in a certain direction if there's things that you want to talk about.
I think whatever you have, you know, would be good. And there may be some questions later.
Okay, sure. Okay, well then, if it's okay with you, I'll go ahead and share my screen. I have some slides I can go through. I will try to talk through them as best I can so that anybody that's just on the phone will know what I'm talking about. Okay. Okay, are you able to see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay. All right, so the basic things I have in this slide set to talk about are an overview of floodplain mapping. So talking about FEMA's flood insurance maps, what flood zones are, what floodplain mapping is, what some of the limitations are to it. And then I will talk about some of the floodplain mapping resources that the public can view online. All right, so the main source of floodplain mapping that you're going to see is from FEMA, and this is in conjunction with the National Flood Insurance Program, which was created in 1968 to provide flood insurance and to help to reduce flood damages by restricting development in floodplains. And so FEMA has developed flood insurance rate maps. You'll see it abbreviated as FIRM, which show the mapping of flood zones, which are used for flood insurance rating purposes. The primary feature of the maps is the special flood hazard area. So this is the high risk flood zone according to FEMA. And it's also known as the 100-year floodplain or the 1% annual chance floodplain. And in this zone, there's a mandatory flood insurance purchase requirement if a home has a federally backed mortgage. So FEMA's flood insurance rate maps are updated periodically, but it's not on a regular schedule. So maps are typically used by communities also in the regulation of land use, so not just for flood insurance purposes. So, you know, I know you're interested in Sussex County. So every so often there's a countywide update to the maps, which doesn't necessarily mean that everything on the map is updated, but there's been sort of a wider ranging series of studies for a county so that, you know, a larger part of the maps are updated. So for Sussex County, the last countywide map update went into effect on June 20th, 2018. So in addition to these countywide studies, which are typically initiated by FEMA, there are a couple other ways that floodplain maps get updated. Sometimes community or us at the state or FEMA will see a need to update the mapping for, you know, a particular area or a particular river or stream. And so there may be a study done just for, you know, one single stream in order to update the mapping just for that, you know, location or that stream. Maps also sometimes get changed or updated in conjunction with development. So if a developer is changing the landscape in or building houses in an area where there's no mapped, well, I guess in some cases, depending on the county or municipal code. It can be in places where there's no mapping, but often it's in places where there's sort of approximate mapping without flood elevations noted. There'll be a requirement for the developer to do a floodplain study and change the area of the map that's associated with that development. So sometimes you'll see kind of a variety of different ways that the maps get updated. So this chart I like to show because I think it helps people think about the 100-year floodplain or the 1% annual chance flood zone, which again is that special flood hazard area where mandatory flood insurance purchase requirement exists. And what this shows is that over a 30-year period, if you have a property that's located in the 100-year floodplain, there's a 26% chance or greater of having flood damage. So, 1 in 100 can seem like a really small number, but over a 30-year period, it's 26% chance or greater. So relatively high chance of having flood damage at one of those properties. All right, so if we're going to talk about floodplain mapping, it's important to understand what some of the things on the map means, in particular, what the different flood zones are. So within the special flood hazard area, the flood zones that are shown on FEMA's maps are kind of broken up into two groups. There's A zones and there's V zones. So I'll start with V zones. The V stands for velocity. So this is a coastal area that's subject to wave action. So this is what you're going to see right up along the coast where there's not only a chance of flood risk, but you would expect to see waves with that flooding. So that would be the VE zone. And then there's a number of different A zones. So we have just a zone that's labeled with just an A. In that area, the mapping's done using approximate methods. So there are no flood elevations provided there, just the boundary of the floodplain. There's an AE zone, and this is an area where there's been more detailed mapping done and flood elevations are provided. There's also an AO zone, which you don't see too frequently. There's a few areas along the coast that have AO, and this is an area of shallow flooding. And instead of showing an elevation there, there's a flood depth, which is typically between 1 and 3 feet. So you might see a zone that says AO2. That means there'd be 2 feet of water during a 100-year storm. And then there's also areas that are outside of the special flood hazard area, which is generally called the X zone. This is an area of lower flood risk. So there's a shaded X zone. This is an area of moderate flood hazard. It's also known as the 500-year floodplain or the 0.2% annual chance floodplain. And then there's an unshaded X zone, which is pretty much anything outside of that. There's an area of lower hazard. And so anything outside of the 500-year floodplain. All right, so I'm not sure how much of the science you want to get into. I was asked to talk about how floodplain maps are developed. So this slide is sort of the technical aspect of how the modeling is done. So I will go over this quickly, but I'm happy to get more in depth into the science of it if there's questions. So there's 2 main components to mapping a riverine or an inland floodplain. The first is hydrology, which involves different ways of modeling a watershed to figure out what the flow rate would be in the stream or the river, what the peak flow rate would be during a 100-year storm. So there's a number of different ways of doing it, but the outcome is that flow rate, or sometimes a hydrograph, which shows kind of how the flow rate changes over time in the stream. And then the results of that are used in a hydraulic model. And that's a model kind of the physical characteristics of a stream or a river. And that's used to figure out what the water elevation is during a flood. And then coastal floodplain mapping is done a little bit differently. So there's two main components there. There's storm surge analysis, where essentially a set of storms are modeled, and the result is still water elevations along the coast. So still water 100-year flood elevations. And this type of modeling is done typically at like a regional scale. So you're not going to just study a small area of the coast. The last one that was done by the Army Corps of Engineers, and I believe it covered, a big swath of the East Coast. And that's where these still water elevations come from. And then in conjunction with that, there's overland wave modeling to predict what the height of the waves would be on top of that still water elevation. And so this figure here kind of gives you a little more detail on what the flood zones look like as you kind of move inland from the coast. So as I mentioned, right at the coast, there's that VE zone where you're expecting waves, a wave height of greater than or equal to 3 feet. And then as you move in from that, you move into the AE zone. So there's I see we have a question, I think. Yes.
Sorry for the interruption.
Sure.
Since Delaware has so much, especially Sussex County in particular, has so much inland waterways, marshes and rivers, do both these models apply to like Sussex County? The riverine and the coastal?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, they do. So as you're further inland, riverine models are done. And there's a lot of area in Sussex County where kind of the streams are flowing into the coastal areas. And typically what's done there is you have a model of the stream, but you also have the coastal model, and whichever elevation comes out higher is what's shown on the map. So like the coastal elevation, let's say we have a coastal elevation of, 10, right? That'll be carried inland until it hits the riverine elevation of 10, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so on the coastal AE zones, you have the area sort of right inside of the VE zone where you also might expect some waves between 1.5 and 3 feet. And then you sort of have the areas outside of that where there's not as much of a wave risk. All right, so this is just an example of what a floodplain map looks like. I think this is in Lewis. Lots of different flood zones on it. You can see anything that's in that like bluish color, that's the special flood hazard area. You can see there's lots of different zones. There's AE zones, there's VE zones shown here. And that kind of orangey brownish color, that's your 500-year floodplain or your shaded zone X. And this is from a website that FEMA puts out called the National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer. So I'll mention that there are some limitations to these firms that FEMA developed, particularly given that the primary intent of these maps were to be used for flood insurance rates. They don't take into account maybe everything you might want to think about as far as flood risk goes. So these maps are based on whatever the conditions were at the time of the study. So the ground topography, the hydrology, whatever the land use is in the area, at the time of the study, that's what the basis of the mapping is. So if there's changes, it's not always accounted for if the map's not been updated. And future conditions are not considered. So things like sea level rise, changes in storm climatology, loss of wetlands, erosion, those are not factored into the current maps. There's no consideration of back-to-back storms. So when we're mapping a 100-year storm, you're not mapping a 100-year storm today and another one 3 days from now, right? So that second one, if the ground's saturated, if dunes have eroded away, if there's been other damages associated with the storm, and you have another one hit again, obviously the damage is going to be worse for that second one. Another thing that's not considered that's shown in the little picture here is, there can be things like debris flow that happen during a storm, right? If a structure gets washed away and blocks up the stream, water's going to go places maybe it hasn't gone before. So, so every flood is different, and, the maps can't necessarily capture every scenario. All right, so next I was going to move into some of the resources for viewing floodplain mapping. So there's a few resources that FEMA offers. The official repository for FEMA floodplain maps is the FEMA Map Service Center. And I have the web address up in the corner here. It's just msc.fema.gov. And so you can go to this website, you can type in an address and hit the search button, and it will bring you to the floodplain mapping for that location. There's also a link that you'll see here that says search all products. And that's a good way to get some additional information about the floodplain mapping. And I'll show you what you get when you click on that. So if you hit that search all products button, it brings you to this screen, which allows you to pick a state, county, community. You can also just pick the whole county if that's what you're interested in, and you hit search, and it's going to bring you to all of the map products that FEMA has for that location that you've selected. So here we go. I had selected the town of Laurel, and here's the list of results. So you get effective products. So that's, I think this may be done a while. This may have been a search that I did a while ago. So I don't know if you'd get the same exact results if you did it today, but you get effective products. So those are FEMA's maps and studies that are currently in effect. If there are preliminary products, you'll get those. So those are new maps that are still under kind of final review before they're adopted as the official maps. You can also look at historic products. So if you want to look at older floodplain maps, maybe you want to see how the mapped floodplain has changed over time, you can look there. And then there are sometimes flood risk products. So these are additional flood risk information sources that FEMA may develop in conjunction with their mapping projects. So they're sort of optional. Sometimes they'll be available and sometimes they aren't, depending on the community. All right, I mentioned the FEMA National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer. That's another place you can go to view the mapping. Here's what the website looks like. You can type in an address, and view the mapping for any location in the country. All right, so in order to have a tool that's more focused on Delaware and can have some additional resources besides what FEMA offers, DNREC has developed a website called the Delaware Flood PlanningTools. And so this is a place you can go to look at floodplain mapping just for Delaware. And the website is listed in the bottom corner here. It's just de.gov/floodplanning. And so if you go to that website, this is what the main screen is going to look like. So you can see it says search or click. You can put in an address or a tax parcel number and do a search, and it'll bring you to that location. It looks like maybe we have a question.
Yes. Yeah. Hi, Gina. Just
Hi.
quickly,
Sure.
do you get any information from the universities to put into your planning tool? Do you consider like what they put out, like University of Delaware, right down there in Lewis? Because I think they have maps too.
Okay. Well, I will get to some of the things that we show in the tool.
Okay.
There are some there's some sea level rise mapping that I think the university had some role in that we show. But yeah, otherwise, it's primarily FEMA floodplain mapping that's shown here
Okay.
with a few other layers added.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, so you can search for an address or you can just zoom into an area if that's easier for you. So I think I already mentioned this. So the main purpose of this website is to enable viewing of FEMA floodplain mapping for Delaware with some additional resources added. So some of the features are a location search, location-specific results for a property. So you can click anywhere and get results that are specific to that location. There's a number of different layers you can turn on or off, which I'll go through. You can make a map printout. You can also download hydraulic models. So kind of the supporting models for, this is mainly for the inland mapping. And that's generally not of interest to the general public, but more for engineers or, community managers that are working on a project in a particular location and might need that information. So here I show, you can click on a location on the map. So this is the address of DNREC's office in Lewis. And your location will be highlighted and then a results box will pop up. And so this is what the results box looks like. I'll go over some of the basic information it gives you. So it tells you your flood zone at the point that you clicked on. It tells you what the base flood elevation is. And so this is FEMA's 100-year flood elevation. So here we've got an elevation of 9. It'll tell you the number of FEMA's map panels. So FEMA still keeps their maps organized based on map panels like you would if you're using the old paper maps. It'll tell you when that map was produced. So this one was 2015. It'll tell you your watershed that you're in. And then you can click on more details and it'll have some of the same things, but it'll also give you some ranges and some other information for the property. So if you look down here kind of on the bottom right, you'll see ground elevation height at the parcel. So that's telling me, the ground surface ranges between 1 and 7. I see that my flood height is 9 on that property. So, there could be the potential for some significant flood depths, during a storm. There's also a print button on the bottom. If you want to make your own little PDF map, you can click on that. And then there's a lot of different layers you can turn on or off if you want to view different things in your mapping. So I'll go through those quickly. So there's contours. These are topographic elevation contours that will show you what the ground surface elevation is. There's FEMA floodplain map layers. So, the base flood elevation that I mentioned, you can turn on the layer to view that. Let's see, the transects and cross sections are usually used by engineers. There's a LIMWA, that is the limit of moderate wave action. And that sort of delineates the area of coastal floodplain where you'd expect waves of 1.5 feet or greater, or where you would not. Let's see what else. And then the layer called FEMA flood maps, that's what actually turns on and off the floodplain mapping itself. We have sea level rise inundation layers that were developed by DNREC, I think in conjunction with the Delaware Geologic Survey. And I'm trying to remember if I go through this later on. I'll give you a brief overview of what that is now. So these sea level rise layers show basically where the high tide is now. So mean higher high water, which is sort of like the average high tide level. And then it shows with increments of 1 foot added to it. So this would sort of show you where the kind of higher high tide level is, if there was 1 foot of sea level rise, 2 foot, 3 foot, up through 7 feet. So you can visualize, where the water might go. So this isn't really a prediction of how much sea level rise there will be. It's just sort of showing you, if we have this much sea level rise, here's where the water would be. And then you can also see different watershed boundaries on the mapping. Let's see, this is that map printout feature that I mentioned. So if you want to have your own PDF map to send to somebody of a certain location, you can use that. All right. And there's my contact information if you have questions about floodplain mapping. I'm happy to go through the tool, sort of the flood planning tool, you know, and show you around it some more if people have interest in that, or I'm happy to talk about any other questions you may have about floodplain mapping.
I think we have a question from Fran. What is the hydraulic model stream center lines used for?
Oh, sure. Yes. Let me back up to that. I think that was on here. Hydraulic model stream center line. So I mentioned that one of the features of our flood planning tool is the ability to download hydraulic models. So again, these are the models that support the floodplain mapping, mainly for the inland modeling and mapping. And so these models are available from FEMA, but it's sort of a cumbersome process to get them from FEMA. You have to put in a request and it takes a while. So we have them available to download on our tool. And so that layer, when you turn it on, shows you where we have a model. So we don't have the models for all of the streams, but for the ones we do, if you turn that layer on, you'll see a line that corresponds to the stretch of the stream or river where that model is available.
Thank you. I think I have a question. The DEMA and FEMA use the same map?
So yeah, I guess so. I mean, DEMA sort of has a little bit of a different role in emergency management in the state than you know, FEMA does working nationally. But yeah, I mean, the floodplain maps that I was showing are used by most government agencies. I mean, local municipalities use them. DEMA would use them if they had a need, you know, and FEMA uses them as well.
Another question we had was the revision of the flood maps, and who initiate those? I mean, individual homeowners, when they raise the houses up, does that affect the flood map for that particular parcel or the area?
Yeah, so as far as initiating the flood map revisions, it just depends. There's different ways it happens. So sometimes FEMA decides that they want to update, you know, a portion of the maps. They find something that's outdated and they'll initiate a study. So it can happen that way. At DNREC, if we're aware of areas that either are unmapped and we feel like there should be floodplain maps shown there, or areas that are in need of an update, sometimes DNREC initiates a study if we have funding available for a particular location. Sometimes a community, a municipality will initiate a study if they feel the need for their community. Sometimes developers will update the maps, either because they're getting ready to do a development, or if they're building something that would change flood elevations, there would be a requirement to update a section of the mapping. If things like new bridges or dams get built that might impact the floodplain mapping, then there's a requirement for an update for those as well. As far as individual homeowners go, so if a person was making changes to their property, like if a house has already been built and they're elevating their house, it would depend on the specifics of what they're doing as to whether a map revision would be required. Some people do submit information to FEMA for what's called a letter of map amendments, and that's typically used to show that your house is, based on elevation, is outside of FEMA's floodplain. So people do that for insurance purposes if either they think they should have a different flood insurance rate, or think that the mandatory purchase shouldn't apply to their property, then they'll do that kind of submittal to FEMA.
Mhm. So can they fill the land, the lot, to get out of the floodplain map?
So yeah, that depends on the land use regulations of whatever the municipality is. So Sussex County, if I assume that's what you're interested in, or if there was a particular municipality in Sussex County, they're in charge of regulating floodplain development in their community. And so, each community has a floodplain development code, which specifies, whether or not fill can be placed in the floodplain, and all of the restrictions around that. So if somebody's building something in the floodplain, the community requires a floodplain development application to make sure that development or construction complies with the floodplain ordinance.
Okay, thank you. Janice has her hand up.
Oh, yeah, hi. I'm just guessing that you use ArcGIS a lot for compiling all this data, which is a bear of a program. Okay. Yeah, I fiddle with it once in a while.
Okay.
But the plume maps relative to saltwater intrusion, do you generate those? Because to me, that seems important to know how far inland below surface, regardless of the contours, the salt water has gotten, because that could be a problem.
Yes, I definitely agree that with sea level rise, saltwater intrusion into groundwater can be an issue. That is completely outside of the area that I work in, though. So, that's kind of a separate issue from flooding. There are folks at DNREC that work on sea level rise, and I honestly don't know the specifics on the mapping that they do. That I'm not sure if that's a product that they offer or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Well, that would be the people that we would ask then.
Yeah, so in the division of, there's a division at DNREC called Climate, Coastal, and Energy, and there's a group there that works on things pertaining to sea level rise. So, from a flood perspective, I have some involvement with sea level rise and how it will impact flooding, but me personally, I haven't worked on the groundwater intrusion kind of mapping.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else has any questions? I think Keith,
Bo has her hand up.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you can give us the contact information for the people who do deal with the saltwater intrusion.
I can look into that and get it back to you, after the call.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Keith.
Yeah, I have a question, and please don't take this the wrong way.
Sure.
I don't know if you've been working just in Delaware or if you've worked in other states or other areas. I'm just curious how that compares, if you have worked elsewhere.
As far as how floodplain mapping compares, is that?
Well, yeah,
question,
and then the accuracy of the the maps that exist already.
Yeah, sure. So on the whole, I'll say that Delaware's maps are pretty up to date compared to some other states. So there's some other states that, so one of the big pushes FEMA's done in recent years is actually conversion to digital maps. So there are actually places in the country where the maps aren't even available online. Like there's not a GIS digital conversion of the boundary, right? So if you want to see the floodplain mapping for a location, you might be able to see either a paper map or a scan of the paper map. Some places haven't had their floodplain mapping updated at all since it was first developed in accordance with the National Flood Insurance Program starting. There are places where there's a lot of unmapped floodplains, right, where the mapping just hasn't been done. So, you know, comparing comparing Delaware to other states, you know, on the whole, our mapping is pretty up to date. I mean, there's certainly improvements, and, you know, things change and the maps need to be updated on a regular basis, but they're pretty good, generally speaking.
Well, sort of a follow-up question, if I can ask it, is given all the development that's going on in Sussex County, especially in the coastal areas, and I don't know the size of the maps, if there's a standard size map. I know from like what you showed Lewis, and all of those maps, they look like they cover a relatively small area, which probably is a really good thing. But because of all those maps, are they individually updated at the same time, or some are updated and other ones aren't? Like I think it said it was June of 2018, the county map was done, but is that one map, or is that all the maps in Sussex County?
Yeah, so, you know, kind of carrying over from when maps were done, kind of all on a paper basis, you know, there's still these map panels, but it's not, things aren't really updated by panel anymore. You know, it's typically updated for a particular stream or a particular coastal area, or maybe, you know, for a particular municipality. So there might be a coastal town where there's, you know, an updated, you know, mapping version done just for that town. So it's not, the updates aren't really based on those panels, but those are still kind of used and listed for organizational purposes.
Okay. So the Sussex County sort of as a whole was done effective, I think it was June 2018. So that would that trigger any kind of changes to those map panels?
Yeah, so I don't know that any of the panel numbers were changed during that map update. I don't know for sure. Sometimes, yeah, I mean, honestly, the map panel boundaries don't matter that much anymore, right? I mean, the studies are done consistently throughout. I will mention, in case wasn't clear earlier, like when they do a countywide update, that doesn't necessarily mean that every single stream or coastal area in the county is remodeled. There's sort of priorities of what needs to be modeled. Sometimes they might, for a particular stream, they might use the modeling that was done previously, but superimpose that on new topographic data. So it's sort of just, they call that a redelineation, where they're just kind of redelineating the flood elevations on better topographic data. You know, there's sort of all different types of updates that can happen depending on, you know, funds that are available and what the most critical needs are. DNREC, we have a study that we're working on now. We've done a couple in Sussex County. So we worked on a study of Clearbrook, which is in the Seaford area, and those maps were recently updated there. And that was an area where DNREC had identified some inaccuracies in the mapping and decided that you know, a study was needed. We're working on one now on Bundix Branch, which is a small stream, I guess kind of west of Lewis. And this is an area where the modeling and mapping is very old, and there are development projects proposed in the area and more people moving in that area. And so we felt like it was a priority to have more accurate maps in that area.
Okay. How long does it take to update a map if you do something like that, like the Bundix Branch area that you were talking about?
Yeah, so depending on the size of the stream, you know, it takes maybe, let's say, 3 to 6 months to do the engineering, the modeling, and the mapping. You know, sometimes there's things like field survey involved, and then there's engineering models that are done, and then the maps are generated. And then there's a whole time frame to submit it to FEMA and get it approved. So that process can really vary depending on how the review with FEMA goes. So typically 3 to 6 months for FEMA to review and approve a draft map that's submitted, and then there'll be a public appeal period of 90 days before the map actually goes into effect.
Okay, so just a ballpark, probably a year from somebody starting until at least a year.
Yeah.
It could be longer depending on public comment, et cetera, the complexity.
Yes, yeah, I would say
Okay.
that's a good estimate.
Okay, good, thank you.
Janice, do you have your hand up? Or? Okay, Bo just say thank you. And I have a few questions. There are so many maps. And some maps, it seems to be changed. The domain names are changed and transferred to another, and it gets very confusing. Is there any central place that we can rely on? And each time there's a new something comes up, we get all excited and go look at that. And then there's something else comes up and we forget about the previous ones, like first map or the flood factors, and there's so many.
Okay, yeah. So as far as the mapping I've been showing you today, the official FEMA floodplain mapping, that map service center website I gave you, I mean, that's the official repository for FEMA floodplain maps. So they will always have the current mapping shown there. And our Delaware Flood PlanningTools shows FEMA's mapping. So we always have FEMA's latest mapping on there. The only caveat is that if FEMA adopts a new map, sometimes it takes a couple days before it gets from their computer system, through and then updated, to show on our, planning tool. So if a map changes and you look that very day, you may be like, oh, there's a discrepancy. It's just taking a day to make it from one place to the other. So those are always up to date. Some of the other things you mentioned, so First Map is kind of like the repository for GIS data for the state. So yeah, I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs of when those data sets change, but I mean, those are typically data sets, things like land use or lots of different statistics for the state that I think are updated as new data becomes available. Flood factor is a whole different kind of mapping. I mean, that was put out by a private entity. So, that would be up to them as to how they're disseminating that and when they would update that. And that's done very differently from FEMA's floodplain mapping.
Thank you. Bo, you had your hand up. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, we observe an awful lot of developing going on, as we mentioned, and it seems like there's an awful lot of fill dirt brought in. And perhaps that community or developer got the permission that they needed to do that. But when that permission is granted, are they also taking into account the cumulative effect of multiple communities up and down, say Route 54 or Route 20 or wherever, that are filling in and then creating a flood hazard for adjacent areas? Who oversees that?
So the county oversees that. So they require floodplain permit applications. So if somebody's putting fill in the floodplain, the county would require a floodplain application. And, I don't know what their process is for kind of keeping an eye on cumulative fill, but, they're the ones that are responsible for regulating the development in the floodplain there. So if there is fill in the floodplain that would have an impact on like FEMA's floodplain mapping, the community would require a submittal to FEMA to get the maps changed. Now, I mean, that's sort of different from, if you're looking at the very individual property level, right? If your neighbor puts a lot of fill in, that can kind of change the drainage around the property, right? And you might see some changes to where the water's going. you know, those sorts of drainage things are sort of outside the scope of floodplain mapping. Not that they're not important and they don't cause water damage, but you know, those are dealt with more at the community or the municipal level. And yeah, I'm not quite as involved with those.
Okay, thank you.
Shelley, you have your hand up.
Hi, Gina. Thanks for educating us today.
Sure.
I was wondering, like you mentioned the hearing, the presentation, and is it verdict or I forgot the name of the
The stream of Bundix Branch.
Bundix, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, like what triggered that? And you know, it seems like there's a lot of mapping changes all the time, but those aren't subject to public input or hearings or whatever. So is it because DNREC is doing the one on Burdick's branch? Is that the
Bundix Branch, yeah. So the Bundix Branch study was triggered by DNREC becoming aware of, you know, sort of a watershed that had outdated mapping and had the potential for significant development. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, if a developer is proposing a subdivision or some kind of building or something in a floodplain where there's those zone A approximate floodplain mapping that I mentioned earlier, where there's no base flood elevations. Typically they're required to do a study to identify what the flood elevations are in that area that they're developing. And so sometimes what can happen if there's a lot of development happening in an area is you would have developers submitting lots of these little tiny studies, which would result in a floodplain map where you've kind of got all these little piecemeal things put together by a bunch of different developers, right? So sometimes, you know, if we see that happening and there's funds available and we think it's, you know, a good use of DNREC's resources, then we might decide to do a study, which was the case for Bundix Branch, so that we can have sort of a smoother, perhaps more reliable floodplain mapping for that area. So whenever a floodplain map goes into effect, there is the opportunity for the public to appeal the map. So when DNREC's doing a study, we try to get the public's input early if we can, right? If somebody has awareness of flooding in an area or lack of flooding in an area, right? If somebody says, my family's owned this house for 100 years and the flood waters only ever came to here, like that's all information we want to know, because we can use that to make a more accurate study. So we typically, like as we did with Bundix Branch, we'll try to engage with the public if we can to get any input that people have to work into the study.
so the hearing's really to collect more information, more.
Yeah, so we're not really
information.
having a hearing. I mean, that one, sometimes there are public meetings, sometimes it's other forms of outreach, right? It could be newspaper notices, it could be a website, which we've been doing more frequently now, particularly with not being able to have as many public meetings with COVID. But yeah, so it depends on the study. So like for that one in particular, you know, we haven't submitted anything to FEMA yet. We are trying to get some input from the public. If anybody had anything they wanted to tell us before we submitted it, so that we could take that into account. Once FEMA's approved a study, before a new map would go into effect, there's always a 90-day appeal period. So, you know, and then there are public notices, either in the newspaper or by letter to affected property owners, and maps can be appealed. Now that has to be based on technical data. You can't just say like, I don't like that floodplain map. You have to submit to FEMA technical reasons why you think the mapping is wrong. But so there is that chance, you know, to appeal a map if you feel that it's, you know, not matching reality.
I have a couple other quick ones too. Can you, like, it seems that when people talk about non-tidal versus tidal areas, it seems like it's written in stone somewhere, but is that really the case? Or does non-tidal ever change into a tidal area?
Yeah, I mean, sure, that's certainly not set in stone. You know, as with sea level rise, I mean, you're certainly going to see some inland movement of tidal areas. You know, as far as the actual floodplain maps go, I talked earlier about how we kind of match up the coastal elevations with the inland riverine elevations as you move to an area that's sort of on the edge of that tidal influence. And, you know, as conditions change in the future, you know, if those coastal flood elevations are increasing, you know, that would probably be shown on the map. You'd see that elevation carried further inland, basically.
And I have one more quick one. You know, there's been so much development in Sussex County, and they're clearing forests and things like that. Do they, is that a trigger for DNREC or FEMA to take a look at that to see if the, you know, the floodplain is changing because of deforestation?
I haven't really seen that as a trigger for a specific study that I can think of. As part of the land use regulation process, you know, if somebody's clearing, you know, a wide area of forest, right, that is going to have an impact on runoff off of that area and could increase flood elevations. So the county or the municipality would typically require stormwater permit, you know, stormwater management permitting as part of their development process, so that a property owner is not increasing runoff downstream from their site. So again, that would be like county or municipality that would regulate that. I think in Sussex County, those reviews go through the Sussex Conservation District. But so they should be monitoring and managing that so that an individual property owner is not greatly increasing runoff off of their site.
Thank you, Gina.
About the runoff, is that by the whole subdivision or individual lots within the subdivision, or both?
So when they're doing a new subdivision development, I think typically they're looking at runoff off of the whole development, right? So I haven't looked at what the Sussex County stormwater regulations say recently, but you know, you might be required to maintain runoff in a 100-year storm at the same level before development as after. So, you know, you see a lot of development with stormwater ponds, right? That's the purpose of those stormwater ponds. And, you know, I live up in Newcastle County, so I'm more familiar with what the stormwater code says up here, but you know, that's the purpose of stormwater ponds and other stormwater features on properties, is to maintain runoff from that property or from that subdivision at the level that it was prior to the development.
Also, the public input, is the public input available to the public?
Are you asking like if somebody submits comments, are those available to the public? That's a good question. I guess it would depend on the specific project, but I don't know. I could look into that.
It seems to be under FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. Not that you would want necessarily somebody to have to file a FOIA request, but it seems like that kind of information should be, because if that's a public process and there's solicitation of public input, then it seems like that should be the case.
Yeah, that would make sense to me. I mean, I haven't had a lot of most of the floodplain studies that I've done in recent years have been smaller, and you know, a lot of the input that I get is just an individual homeowner calling to ask questions or to say, let me tell you what I've seen on my property historically, you know, and then so that we can have that information to factor into our study.
Well, related to that, if people down here wanted, or anywhere in the state for that matter, I lived in Newcastle County for 16 years before I moved down here in Sussex County for the last 10 years. But anyway, I'm curious if there's a website or a link where, if we're interested in seeing what is out there for public comment, like you mentioned, a website and some other things, if you're interested in getting public input on some of these things. Is there a link that we would go to, or and there are many of these going on at any given time?
Yeah, so there are not many going on at a given time. So if DNREC, at least for the floodplain program, if we're looking for public input, we'll put a press release out. So there is a website for DNREC press releases that you could look at. So like for this Bund Experience project that we've been talking about, in order to get public inputs, we made a website that describes the study and put out a press release. And, we also, we'll try some more direct contact if, maybe to representatives in an area. It depends on the project, how we would do the more contact, but, we try to get the information out to the people that would be interested. Like for that study, because we're in the early stages of it, it's not like a formal public comment period. It's just, hey, we want the public to be aware that we're doing this study. If there's anything you want us to know while we're doing this study, please let us know. That's kind of the stage we're at now.
Okay. Could you send, if there, you mentioned there's a website about that, could you send that to Yule? And the reason I'm
Sure.
interested, I think it might be over near a place where we own some land. So
Okay.
I'm curious if it is or not. So.
Okay, well, I will send it to her, and it also has a very easy web link if you want to try it, which is just de.gov/BundXBranch.
Okay.
So you could also try, but I'll send it to her as well.
Okay, that sounds easy. Thank you.
I have another question about the flood elevation. I know somewhere nearby it's 6 foot elevation, and the other one I saw on the map today was 9 feet high. So are they different, and how are they because of the historic incidents of flooding?
Yeah, I mean, so the flood elevations are based on the modeling and the studies that were done, at wherever the location is. So, I mean, there's a lot of different things that go into it. So, you're going to see different flood elevations at different locations. If there's like a specific area where you have questions or something like that, I mean, I would be happy to look at it with you, but, generally it's based on the results of the engineering models for that location.
Yeah. In the inland base, there are like 6 foot elevation, and it looks like in Lewis it's 9. It's not that far, but because maybe inland bay has more flooding risks, the water does not get out to the ocean once it comes in. I have no idea, but I used to think it was about 6 feet. When I saw 9 feet in Lewis, I thought that was very different.
Okay, yeah, and another thing just to mention too is when you see the flood elevation on the maps, just to realize that that's an elevation. So, based on grounds, it's not a depth of flooding. So sometimes people get mixed up about that. Like, they see base flood elevation of 7 and they think that means 7 feet on the ground, but really that means if your ground elevation is 5 and your flood elevation is 7, then you would expect 2 feet of water.
Okay. Another question I have is, I hear something like a community credit. I forgot the exact term. If the community does certain things, then the insurance rate can be lowered. Is that still going to be true after October rate change?
Yes. So there's a FEMA program called Community Rating System, or you'll see it abbreviated CRS. Yeah, so that's the program you're talking about. So essentially, if the community meets there's sort of a whole point system of if you kind of go above and beyond FEMA's minimum standards for floodplain management, then they'll give you credits. And depending on how many points you get in their system, then your community gets rated. It's like a 1 through 10, where 1 is like the best. There may be very few in the country that are 1, and then 10 is the lowest. And the percent, so the percentage discount in the community is based on what level your community achieves. So for the communities that participate, then under the current flood insurance program, only properties within the special flood hazard area get a discount. So let's say, I don't remember, but let's say your community is a level 8 on the scale, then maybe those properties get like a 10% discount on their insurance premium. I don't know if that's the right number for that level, but
Jeannie, what types of
under the new, sorry, I was gonna say, under the new program, that is supposed to continue, and actually the discount will be offered to all properties in the community, not just the ones in the special flood hazard area.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Shelley?
Hi, sorry about that. What types of things do they do to participate in that to get to the discount? And does it also go the opposite way if they build in a flood-prone area and they don't do anything to offset? Do you rate?
So in order for a community to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program so that the residents can buy flood insurance, there are minimum standards that FEMA puts out about development and mapping and things like that. So, so all communities that participate have to meet those minimum standards. So if you're not meeting those standards, you can get kicked out of the program, basically. So the community rating system gives credit for going above and beyond that. So it can be things like more restrictive floodplain development ordinance. So some communities require what's called freeboards. So like instead of elevating a new home to FEMA's 100-year flood level, they'll say you need to elevate a new home to that level plus 2 feet. Or there's all kinds of like higher standards that can be applied. There's credits for things like outreach and communications. Yeah, you could look up the community rating system and you can see there's a whole list of different things that FEMA gives credit for. And so kind of each additional flood risk management thing that the community does, they can get points for, and then depending on how many points it is, then that's what their rating is in the program. And not all communities participate. It's a voluntary thing, and not all communities opt into that. Probably the majority of them do not.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have one that it's a jurisdictional question as to like the use of the potential use of the maps. So if there are wetlands involved in or near a development, proposed development, some of that is frequently identified as federally controlled or federally regulated, which would, in all intents and purposes, I think, refer to USACE, or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and other times it's DNREC. Do they? I assume they use the same maps. Are those maps that they get from you, or would they have access to other flood maps or water wetland maps that might not be a flood map? Because I guess not all wetlands are in not all wetlands are in a floodplain. Is that correct, or would that be?
That's correct. So wetlands are mapped completely separately from floodplains. So okay. Delaware has a set of state wetlands maps. If you're looking for them online, I believe it's going to be a scan of a paper map. That's what you would find. Okay. They're not available digitally as far as I know. But the criteria for what makes something a wetland is actually different, and I'm not a wetlands expert, but is different from what makes something a floodplain. I mean, often wetlands are in the floodplain, but that's not always the case. So they are two separate things. And you're correct that federally wetlands are managed by the Army Corps of Engineers, and they do have a different criteria for wetlands than the state does.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for this presentation. This is very
Yeah.
interesting and helpful.
Yeah, sure thing.
Do you have a contact in DNREC who oversees the wetland delineation, the tidal wetland?
Yeah, there's two different sections in DNREC that do, there's two different groups in DNREC that do wetlands. There's a section called wetlands and subaqueous lands, and they do permitting. If somebody's going to build something that impacts wetlands. And then there's another group, and again, forgive me because I'm not like the wetlands expert. There's another group that does more kind of managing and tracking wetlands in the state. So what I could do, if I'm going to email you the link for the website for Bundex Branch, I can send you a few other DNREC wetlands websites so that you could take a look and maybe try to, if you have specific, depending on what your questions and your interests are, there could be a number of different contacts at DNREC for that.
All right, thank you. One more question I have. Recently, the council chair said that the state of Delaware made a resolution that DNREC could have jurisdiction over certain land, including the non-tidal wetlands in the whole state of Delaware. Are you aware of anything like that? Because we couldn't find what it is specifically.
That I'm not aware of. That would be a good question for one of our wetlands folks. So yeah, once you're able to take a look at those websites, we could probably identify a contact that could answer that question. I don't know the answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else has
Yeah.
last question? Thank you so much for spending time with us today. And if we have any questions, we will send you more emails too.
Sure, yeah, feel free. I'm happy to answer any floodplain questions you have.
Yes,
Thanks, Gina.
and we will upload this video to probably our website.